conclude your remarks, why are the postmodernists doing this, and to what end?
Well, I think you should distinguish between the postmodernists and postmodernism in some sense, because you don't want to be thinking that, you know, each radical person on the left, let's say for the time being, is a full-fledged avatar of postmodernism, because they're not. They're like, you know, 60% reasonable human being and 40% puppet mouthpiece of a toxic ideology, you know. And so it's fragmented across people, and that makes it, of course, much more complicated, because you get to know someone like that and you think, well, they've got some good intentions, not nearly as many as they think they have, but they have some good intentions, and, you know, they have a history of really things not so good that happened to them. It's no wonder they feel kind of angry about it. It's like, but then that's why you got to get to the bottom of things. It's like, and the bottom is very far down. It's like, this is where things get crazy. It's like, well, there's a battle between two ways of being in life, you know, and I've taken that apart to some degree in my lectures on Cain and Abel. And one way of life is to make the sacrifices that you have to, and to try to aim towards the good and hope that the sacrifices that you make please the Lord, so to speak. It's how you bargain with the future, right? You make sacrifices in the present towards something you hope will be good in the future, and you hope that pleases the reality and it smiles on you, you know. And then the other way of being is that you notice that your hard work is often ignored, and that you don't get what you want, well, less deserving people do, and it turns you against life itself. Like, it turns you against, worse than that, it turns you against being. I don't know how else to put it. I mean, because I've studied, you know, like, why do you go into Connecticut, into a classroom, and shoot a bunch of elementary school kids, and then yourself? I think he shot himself, but it doesn't matter, because usually that's what happens. It's like, what state of mind do you have to be in to do that? Well, I know what sort of state of mind you have to be in to do that, but the only way to describe it, it's so down there that, you know, it gets archetypal, fundamentally. It's like, well, that's the pathway of Cain. It's like, being is something that should not be. I despise every bit of it. I'm going to take my revenge on it. I'm going to find the most innocent people I possibly can and make them suffer. And then I'm going to do away with myself. And that shows you exactly what I think. And, you know, people are like that, man. That's why that's the oldest story. It's basically the oldest story we have about human beings, Cain and Abel. It's like, it's a paragraph long, that story, and it's just a punch, man. That's why we remembered it for, God only knows, 10,000 years maybe. So why are they doing it? Well, they aren't doing it. It's like, we're doing it. That's the thing. It's not them. It just happens to be that they're sort of more doing it now than, you know, maybe the radical right is, you know, but it could easily be flipped around. And, well, that brings me back to the same issue. It's like, well, what do you do about it? It's like, join a group, engage in group conflict. Give up all your beliefs so that you don't believe anything, so that you don't engage in group conflict. Well, then you're nihilistic and hopeless. It's like, so what do you do? Those are your choices. Well, no, they're not. The other choice is, get yourself together in every way. Like, you want to fight this, whatever this is, you want to fight it, well, you got to be strong, because you're going to have to make the right decisions at a moment's notice when the tiny little bits of this manifest itself in your own life. It's like, you're going to stand up at work when they want to retool your unconscious biases. Well, probably not, because people don't. Well, why not? Well, it's no bloody wonder, you know. I mean, look what happens. You know, I said, no, I'm not using those words. It's like, you know, and I didn't do it blindly, although I certainly never predicted what was, who the hell could have predicted what was going to happen? Like, certainly not me, but it's no wonder that people shut up and, you know, hide. Like, why not? It's the smart thing to do in the short term. Well, you know how you feel when you hide. You know, you feel like a pathetic, scared rabbit, and that's what you are. So You got to be more than a pathetic scared rabbit, and you do that by facing the chaos that exists in your own life and turning it into order, and that's how it goes. So it isn't them, you know, that's the problem. It would be so easy, you could just get rid of them. It's like that just doesn't work. I have a bit of a comment on that one. I mean, and it's in keeping with Norman's reference to Jean Piaget. I mean, one of the things Piaget pointed out was that the precursor to moral behavior is the ability to play with others. To play, like technically. I mean, children set up a little fantasy world and then they take their roles in it and they play, and they do that voluntarily unless one of the kids doesn't know how to play, right? And so the kid that does know how to play says, you better play my game or I won't play with you. And any sensible kid just runs off and finds another play partner. But, you know, we don't let, this is such a cliche, we don't let our children play, you know, and that's a big problem because they just learn how to play in a structured environment. That's not play. Because a play is when you have to invent your own game and invent your own rules and negotiate the rules, you know. And so these kids that I think they're hyper protected because they're born to older mothers, and you know there's hardly any of them, and so the mothers are overprotective, and so are the fathers for that matter. But they're old and they're not going to have another kid, so they hyper value the child, and there's only one of them, and so they don't have siblings, and then they structure everything so the kid has the best of everything, which they do, except they don't have any freedom to be idiot children and to, you know, eat dirt and fall on their head and all that sort of thing that you have to do. And you know, it's no wonder, because of the reason, it's a demographic issue, you know, it's no wonder it's happening. But a lot of these kids that are screaming and squawking about, you better play my game or else, they just don't know how to play. They really don't. And so it's no wonder. And well, that's death to morality, because it's predicated on free play, you know. So that's a problem. And so that's not something I know what to do about. Don't you try to encourage your kids. Sorry. You try to encourage your kids. You make them courageous. You don't protect them. That's different, right? You make them courageous. You don't protect them. So you just make them weak then. So.
A lot of questions about human rights tribunals and human rights councils. So just to kind of summarize a bunch of them into one, is there ever a legitimate use for a human rights tribunal or council? And if you could comment also, going forward in the fight over gender expression, gender identity, how do people combat or win that fight in front of human rights courts and tribunals? And yeah, we'll leave it at that.
No. There's no excuse for them. That's why they're called social justice tribunals in Ontario. Like, that's what they're called, and so look it up yourself, and that's what they are. So we had a court system that worked perfectly well, which doesn't mean it worked very well, but it means it works better than any alternative anyone has ever been able to think up. And the Human Rights Tribunal can suspend normal jurisprudential standards. They use preponderance of evidence. They don't assume individual innocence, and they can change the rules as they see fit. And so those bloody things are pathological to the core, and they're mouthpieces of the postmodernist neo-Marxists as far as I'm concerned, and they're setting up a parallel law system. And they're also doing that. They're also, and this is the Wynne government, they're also forcing the universities to adopt particular definitions of sexual harassment that make every, let's call it complicated interchange between human beings into an act of violence. Not that I'm trying to justify stupidity or oppression, but we're all stupid and we're all oppressors, and so the probability that we'll make some sort of dopey sexual error is 100%. And now that's become grounds for, you know, accusations of rape, and they're forcing the universities and the colleges to become parallel legal systems as well. And that's already well advanced. It's already been adopted at the U of T. It's as a consequence of direct legislation, and you better look out, because even if the people who are running those institutions right now are reasonable, which they're not, they will absolutely be replaced by people who exactly want that kind of power and will absolutely use it. So, no, those things should be abolished. We have a legal system. You know, the Law Society, now I may not have this exactly right, but I've got it mostly right. The Law Society in Ontario has already decided that lawyers are racists. They're going to force them to undergo unconscious bias training. And they've come to, and they're agreeing, by the way, they've already come to the conclusion that because the legal profession does not have the precise representation that you'd expect if you did a demographic analysis of the population according to the terms defined by the social justice warriors, that it's racist, and that they're racist, and that they need to be trained unconscious first. It's like, so go ahead, lawyers, like, line up, man, admit your guilt, you're done, and you deserve it too. So, yeah.
Starting to become afraid of the answers to these questions. Can left and right-wing people ever meaningfully communicate with each other? And I'm wondering if you can comment a little bit about temperamentality and the differences therein.
That's what they do in a democracy. Look, the lefties, they're high in openness and low in conscientiousness. And that means they don't like responsibility that much, but they're pretty damn creative. And they're not very orderly, especially they're not very orderly. And that's part of conscientiousness, by the way. And so they're good at being artists and they're good at being entrepreneurs, but they're terrible at running things. But then the conservatives on the other side, they're low in openness, which is the trait creativity. That doesn't mean they're stupid, by the way. It just means their thinking isn't as free form, let's put it that way. And so it's more constrained. And they're high in conscientiousness, especially orderliness. So they're damn good at running things that already work. So you need the liberals. There wouldn't be high openness, low conscientiousness if there wasn't a niche for it. And you need the conservatives. And sometimes the liberals are right, the borders should be more open because that's their fundamental claim. And sometimes the conservatives are right, the borders between things should be more closed. And because they're both right some of the time, and because the environment keeps snaking around, you have to have dialogue between the two sources constantly, so that the polity can orient itself as the snake of the environment moves. And that's why you need free speech. And so the left and the right get along perfectly well together as long as they can talk to each other. But as soon as they can't talk to each other, then the alternative, there's only two alternatives to negotiation. Simple as that. One is slavery, the other is tyranny. So if those you cannot negotiate with will either become your slaves or your tyrants. So you wipe out free speech, then that's what you're left with. And that's why free speech isn't just another right, for Christ's sake. It's not just another right. How dumb can you be to think that? You don't know anything if you think that. It's the mechanism by which people of different opinions talk instead of strangling each other. So, but if you want them to strangle each other, which you might, then really, you might then take away their right to express their opinion and watch the whole thing go up in flames. And go like this, because maybe that's what a big part of you wants. So, well, so, you know, one thing to consider that is if you're a minority, you should at least have the decency to be unsuccessful. Right, you know, and if you regard the system as corrupt, then you're going to regard the people who are successful, say disproportionately even, as ultimately corrupt. And that's kind of convenient if you're angry about the fact that you're not successful. And so, you know, that's not the only driving force, but that's a good part of it, man. So, you know, there's nothing better than being punished for your virtues. So,
you touched on this briefly, but there were quite a few questions about it, so I think it's worth rehashing and perhaps expanding on. What do you make of this strange bedfellowship between the politically correct left and Islamic activities? Is there an element of cognitive dissonance? And I'm wondering if you could also touch on Bill 59 in Quebec right now. This is kind of the Sharia compliance bill that's going on over there. Basically, thought crimes against the Prophet will see you legally reprimanded.
I'll start. So the first part. Sorry, just tell me the first part of that question again, if you would. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. There's nothing contradictory about that, except, you know, arguments have layers, very many layers, and something can be contradictory at one level and non-contradictory at another. It means your thinking is disorganized in some profound way, but it happens all the time because your thinking is disorganized in some profound way. But when push comes to shove, you find out what the basic motivation is, and that's why I said already, the enemy of your enemy, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so if your fundamental goal is to enhance women's freedom, let's say, well then it's going to be pretty rough to climb into bed with, let's say, the Saudis, as I already mentioned. But if your fundamental goal is to wreak havoc with Western civilization, it's like, well, hey, that's not a problem. There's no cognitive dissonance there. You can sacrifice the whole rights thing. It's not like you were really for that to any great degree anyways at the bottom of your nasty little soul. So there's no cognitive dissonance there. It's just another tactic as far as I can tell. And you know, the fact that it also allows for broad-scale attacks on what you might consider, this maybe is putting it a bit too bluntly, the only country in the Middle East that has any resemblance of success, then so much the better, because they're just, you know, representations of patriarchal oppression, because how could they be anything else, since there's no such thing as competence properly defined within the patriarchy. So forget about cognitive dissonance. You just watch what people do when they face a paradox, and then you'll understand their deeper motivations. It's